For those of you that I haven't met yet, my name's Phil. I'm on the team here at Subscript, and I get the absolute joy of being your host today. So during our event, as you undoubtedly know, we're going to be diving deep into the topic of usage-based pricing and the impact that it has on B2B SaaS finance teams. And although today's top priority is definitely to make you even smarter, if that's possible, and to help you learn as much as possible about usage-based pricing, my hope is really that you'll also take this as an opportunity to engage with some brilliant colleagues as you grow your network. I mean, it's really rare to have so many kind, thoughtful, smart finance folks all organized in the same place. So please go ahead and put yourself out there today and make a new friend or two. With that, let me pull up the agenda. And it is action-packed today. So first, in just a few minutes here, we're going to be talking about the state of usage-based pricing with Kyle, who chimed in a few minutes ago, who should definitely be outside enjoying the sunny weather in Boston, but has decided to join us here today. Kyle's on the team at Openview, and they just released some really fascinating research around usage-based pricing. And so we're here to have a conversation and dive deep into it. And then at about 10:15, all of these timings are about, because it's always difficult to predict exactly when we're going to end, but the next session will be about what it's actually like to lead finance at a usage-based pricing business. I'm very excited for this one. We have Chitra, the CFO of Circle CI, joining us. And as you will soon see when she comes on, she's just so brilliant, so smart, and has been at a usage-based business for a while now. So have interesting things to share with us. And then after that, we're totally getting weird in the best way possible. And then we're going to jump into some roundtables where we'll break off into smaller groups and we'll have a good chance to network, share some of our learnings, ask some questions, those sorts of things. And then the part of the agenda that I know that none of you are looking forward to is at some point this does have to end. We have to go back to our normal lives. So at about 11:25, we will officially say goodbye. And as you can kind of see from the agenda, this is not an event, hopefully, where you can just kick your feet up, turn your music on, and zone out for the next few hours. Instead, we're going to make the most of every single minute. And I'd love for you to engage with one another, with our speakers. And that's especially true at the roundtables at the end. Lastly, a few housekeeping items. So the first one, and everyone is so good so far, I'm scared I'm going to jinx it, but just be mindful of the mute button. You have the power to mute or unmute. So please do not unmute to heckle Kyle, me, or Siddharth, or any of our speakers today. All heckling must be done while muted. But during our roundtables and stuff, you'll definitely want to come off. And we'll do Q&A and stuff throughout the day. And so when we do that, I might ask you to come off mute, but just be mindful that you have that power. The next one is have fun and engage, like we've talked about. I'd encourage you, if you're comfortable and if you're able, to go ahead and turn on your video, just so this is a more fun experience for everyone. And if anything is ever on your mind, drop it in chat. We'll do lots of Q&A. We'll have our roundtable. So please, please, please make the most of it. Take this as a great opportunity to meet new folks and kind of learn. And then the last thing is everything is being recorded except for the roundtables. So when we get to the roundtable section, I want you to know that you can feel comfortable openly and honestly sharing whatever the heck you want, because we're not recording that. And then when we're meeting with our speakers, there's no need to take frantic notes because all of that will be recorded and emailed around. All right, any questions before we get started? And if so, drop them in chat here. Okay, I'm not seeing questions yet, so I think we're going to kick things off. And we are going to talk about the state of usage-based pricing. Here's where it's going to get a little interesting, and you're going to have to bear with us. Siddharth is the CEO of Subscript, and he is going to have a conversation with Kyle. But Siddharth also doesn't really have internet right now. So we're going to try and see how this goes. Give me a second here.
If in doubt,
Hello,
I can always
Siddharth.
have a conversation with myself.
No, that just means you'll have to talk with me, Kyle, if Siddharth's internet is being weird. But Siddharth, your internet looks like it's doing okay so far.
I'm tethered to my phone, so,
Okay.
we'll give it a go.
this is perfect. And if it starts to be weird or anything, I'm not even going to give you a warning, Starth. I'm just going to kick you off the stage and I'm taking over. So you have that hanging over you. And Kyle, I'm going to bring you up on the stage too. So Siddharth, as I just mentioned, everyone is the CEO of Subscript. Kyle, many of you probably already know, is a brilliant operating partner at Openview, and is probably, well, in my opinion, might just be the smartest person about usage-based pricing. I think he would probably argue, because he is modest, but a really brilliant thinker on usage-based pricing. And when I thought of this event, Kyle is literally the first person that I reached out to. I was like, if you're doing an event on usage-based pricing and you don't have Kyle there, then what are you doing with your life? So I'm going to leave the stage now. Siddharth, I'm going to leave it to you to get the conversation started. And again, if any technical difficulties come in, I'll hop in and continue the conversation.
Sounds good. Thanks, Kyle, for doing this with us. I'm super excited to chat with you for a whole bunch of reasons. One, we did an interview earlier and you were amazing, and it was so thoughtful. And then two, you all recently published the second edition of the State of Usage-Based Pricing. So I'm imagining this is relatively fresh on your mind, and you have sort of the latest and greatest thinking on pretty evolving topics. So pretty excited. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, I'm wondering if you could just set the stage in terms of how you define usage-based pricing, and if you could share some examples.
Yeah, definitely. Well, excited to be here. I think that there's so many different flavors of usage-based pricing, and we'll get into that. In my mind, at the highest level, usage-based pricing is where you incorporate product usage into your monetization efforts. And so that could be pure play, hey, we only charge on a pay-as-you-go basis, exactly tied to usage. You could think of it, buying those iTunes singles one at a time in the old days. Or usage-based pricing could be part of a subscription, right? You could have a plan that has a certain amount of usage baked in, but is sold on a subscription basis. You could have platform fees on a subscription basis and usage on top. You could have core software subscriptions, but monetize on maybe third-party usage through payments revenue or marketplace revenue or other forms of usage. There's a lot of different flavors of it. And but what I think is most critical is it's not just classic subscription pricing tied to either flat rates where, hey, you're a customer of X size, so you're getting your bill is $50,000 a year. That's our only SKU, our only price point. And it's also not just based on seats. And so seats have historically been like the most common pricing metric for software products. And for a variety of reasons, in my mind, seats don't reflect the value delivered by a lot of modern software products. That's especially true if you think about the rise of generative AI or automation or APIs as part of your value proposition. Like your product value isn't scaling in most cases with having more users needing to log in. And so usage-based pricing in my mind is the shift towards better understanding how folks experience value from our products and tying how we monetize directly to that value.
That makes total sense. In your report, it seemed like most companies are not all the way one way or all the way the other way in terms of either being entirely seat-based or entirely usage-based, or at least it doesn't seem like usage-based companies are largely entirely usage-based. And we were hoping you could walk us a little bit about through what you found in terms of that middle ground of usage-based plus other.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think that this, to some extent, the fault rests on me. But I think to some extent, we've kind of bucketed companies historically as like, hey, these are usage-based companies, right? Like a Snowflake will literally put in their investor presentations, like, we are not a SaaS subscription model. We are a usage-based model. So there's sort of those companies that are all in on usage-based pricing. They don't even have a definition of like ARR that they report publicly on because they just are so bought into this usage mindset. And then you've got companies that have no elements of usage-based pricing in their model. They either have fixed subscriptions or they kind of rely on seats as the core metric around how they scale with the customer. But then that's those are kind of the extremes, and they're the ones that get the most attention. Like we know Atlassian, we know a Snowflake or an AWS or GCP or and other folks on that right-hand side of the screen. But there's actually a lot of like messy middle ground, for lack of a better term. And so you've got a number of companies, GitHub being a canonical example, that maybe started off as seat-based subscriptions, and then they've added products over time, and those products didn't scale well with just being based on having more users logging in. And so with GitHub, they bundle a certain amount of usage of their products into all of their plans, so customers can try them out, and then they can scale and pay more as they consume more of the product. So that provides really great usage-based expansion in GitHub's case. In HubSpot's case, they do have subscription packages, and you buy subscription packages based on the kinds of features that you want. But they also have an element of contact-based pricing. So as you get more contacts that you can market to, and therefore grow your business, HubSpot's going to raise your price because they're delivering more value, and you're generating better outcomes as a business. So there's a core subscription at HubSpot as well, and then usage-based expansion. So there's a lot of these different flavors of hybrid models. I've also seen, I think Autodesk has a really interesting model where it's classically a seat-based subscription, but Autodesk has a host of products, probably dozens of products. And for many of their customers, it can be really hard to figure out how many seats they need for each and every Autodesk product when they might have tens of thousands of employees, right? That also makes it hard once you've licensed seats for someone. It's hard to figure out, hey, like what else should they have access to? And maybe they don't realize that they need access to those products. And so Autodesk has a flex model where it's essentially charging folks on a credits basis, giving them access to the full suite of Autodesk products, but then only charging based on who actually uses the Autodesk products. And so what that gets interesting is that it really forces Autodesk to make sure that they're as customer friendly as possible. They're doing things that drive more usage in an account, and that there's real value. There's no shelfware, right, in this usage-based model. And so there's a lot of different varieties. I've also seen in this economy, I saw one of the comments in the chat was sort of like relevance of usage-based pricing in this economy. I think for me, one of the things that comes up is folks wanting maybe an entry point into your pricing where they're not ready to commit to a big subscription plan. They don't know if they're going to use it all. It's hard to convince their CFO for that budget approval. And you're getting blocked in landing initial deals. And so what I've seen is a number of companies experiment with starter plans at a much lower price point, really go under the radar of procurement, but that have a usage cap on those plans so that you really drive a lot of champions and adoption in an organization, and you can prove that business value, and then you can scale into a bigger subscription based on those proof points, right? But instead of shutting down the deal, you're doing more of a land and expand motion.
I feel like Snowflake's sort of the canonical example of that land and expand, right? It's like virtually free to start. And even for a while, it doesn't become a really large bill that would show up on anyone's radar until it becomes a very large bill that shows up on everyone's radar.
Totally. Yeah, that's the power of what 160, 170% net dollar retention there. It's a pretty amazing business model. But from so I know there's a number of finance and ops folks on this call. From a financial perspective, that's maybe really hard to manage, right? Because you maybe have costs up front, but then a little bit of an unknown revenue associated with the customer. And so how do you manage profitability across your customers? How do you forecast the business if not all of your revenue is committed and locked in? It does create a lot of challenges for finance organizations. My mindset is if it's better for customers and it grows the overall revenue of the business, finance can accommodate that change in business model.
The value delivering point is actually also the Autodesk example made me think of the fact that in the last year or so, a lot of folks, probably folks on this call, have been reviewing what subscriptions their companies have and essentially like asking people to reduce seats where the seats aren't being fully utilized. And actually having usage-based pricing that kind of aligns with value delivered, that's less of a problem where you build up seats and then you'll just knock down a bunch of them when you're trying to cut costs.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating. So there's a couple of ways of thinking about it, right? I think there was a lot of fear that recessions or sort of challenging macroeconomic environments would impact usage-based companies disproportionately because the revenue isn't as committed, as locked in, right? Which means customers can churn more easily or downgrade more easily, right? And so there's some fear in the investor community, or there has been historically fear in the investor community, that usage-based business models would be less resilient. I think that when you look at the market right now, for companies that maybe have a classic seat-based subscription model, they're going to hit multiple sides. They probably oversold customers relative to actual license utilization. A number of companies that I see, the license utilization is 30, 40, 50% of how many seats were sold. On top of that, the customer is scrutinizing their bill much closer than they had before. And they're reducing headcount. So especially on the sales side, maybe on the recruiting side, they've done layoffs or have held headcount flat. And so there's not kind of baked in expansion from adding seats like there was historically. So they're getting pressure both to prove the value within the existing seats and shrinking the footprint within an account. All of that creates a lot of challenges. So I think what I tend to see is that usage-based pricing companies are sort of the canary in the coal mine. They get impacted first if there's an economic challenge. They also get impacted first if the economy starts improving. But there's a lag in the more classic traditional subscription businesses where they have actually maybe even more severe impacts. They're just delayed. And I think what's great in my mind with usage-based companies and why they're so customer friendly is if your customer is in a challenging economic environment, they have a lot of opportunity to course correct, maybe modify their use, right size their use versus the value that they're seeing. It is very customer friendly. And I would rather be in a situation where a customer right sizes their spend but continues using the product and seeing value rather than having them churn entirely. And so like in a classic usage-based pricing, like retention or renewal is generally a non-event because the customer is deciding every day that they want to continue using your product. And so they're essentially making a renewal decision based on their product usage rather than based on a contract that you have. And that's pretty powerful. And then it's a great argument to take to the CFO around why they should continue spending money on your product.
Totally. You briefly touched on the difficulties of forecasting when you're a usage-based business. Do you have any advice for especially this group who's probably responsible for doing that sort of thing?
I do, but it doesn't, I would say it doesn't get particularly easy. I think one thing to be mindful of is your forecast will be less accurate, most likely, than you're probably comfortable with. And it tends to get more accurate as you have more customers, you have more cohorts, as you have more data points. You will get better and data will help you get better. But in the early days of scaling with the usage-based model, there's so many unknowns around seasonality, around the profile of customers, what your ICP looks like, what your customer success model looks like. Like there's just so many unknowns that you have to be comfortable with some element of variability. Now, I've seen in a lot of cases, finance teams tend to underestimate or they kind of are very conservative on the forecast, and then usage-based companies exceed expectations. And I talked to a founder who said that like feedback he got from investors is they had the best performing business, but they were the worst at communicating how good of a business they were because investors kept thinking that the business was, not going to do as well, but would beat their forecasts every quarter. And so I think that there's an element of just getting comfortable with some ambiguity. I think otherwise, like being very data oriented is something that finance folks are data oriented, but in a usage-based company, you really have to get that next level beyond where you already are. And so understanding product usage at a customer level, at a cohort level, how it ramps over time, how it looks different across industries, and then even going to CSMs of your top 50 or top 100 accounts and getting a sense from a qualitative perspective of how usage is trending, what they expect to see in terms of usage. Like, you just end up having to take both the quantitative and the qualitative in order to produce a forecast. But I also think that what that forces a finance team to do is just end up getting closer to the internal stakeholders and to the customers than they would otherwise need to be, which means you can be a more strategic business partner in the organization, right? Finance becomes really strategic in a usage-based company.
Such good points. You did a bit of, there were a lot of questions in the chat about tooling and the modern tech stack around this. So I feel like we're going to get to spend a decent amount of time on this. You did a bunch of research around this, and we were hoping you could walk us through sort of like in broad strokes how you think about it. You categorized it into a few categories, and then sort of any specific ideas or notes that you felt are remarkable.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and yeah, it Phil's sharing a slide here. The reality with pricing is many folks put in the chat, and as I talked about, is that it's not black and white, right, of subscription versus usage-based pricing. We're looking at managing multiple different pricing models, complex data points that go into pricing. All of that has an impact on billing, obviously, revenue recognition, the metrics we use to track the business, how we forecast the business. And customers need to trust their bill, right? Because billing becomes a core part of the customer experience and could be a detractor or an enabler of driving additional usage growth. I think historically, companies were not able to kind of unlock some of the opportunity around pricing because their tech stack held them back. Like, I would hear, hey, we can't implement X because of our billing system or our feature flags or our XYZ. And a lot of times it was internal teams, full engineering teams that were working on complex billing that was bespoke to the exact way that you wanted to manage for your pricing model, which then meant anytime you wanted to change that would be basically impossible, right? Because especially engineering teams want to work on features that add value to the business rather than just allow you to run the business. And so folks were stuck often with models that they know were under optimized or held back from testing ideas that they thought would work well for customers. And now we're starting to see a lot more innovation in this space. And I try to categorize the innovation in this market map here. I think that honestly, the categories are blurring, and a lot of companies are starting to play in multiple categories here. And we're going to learn a lot because many of these companies are seed stage, Series A, maybe Series B. Like, they are now sort of solving problems around pricing for customers, but there's a lot that's going to change. Some categories that I think about, like classically metering and billing is, just one of the most important things to get right. You want to make sure that you are taking all of that usage and event data that you're collecting on customers. You're able to maybe do what if analysis to figure out what your pricing should look like if you wanted to adopt a usage model and what the impacts would be on your business. And then you want to go, build the pricing plans and have them, produce billing in an ideally as trustworthy and automated of a way as possible. And so, metering and billing ends up being a really important kind of part of that core infrastructure. And there's a number of modern tools around it. So that's often a place where folks start. But then you also think about quote to cash. And so on the quote to cash side, this is more tools for your sales team or that get integrated more with CRMs to help sellers with the process of working with customers to forecast usage, figure out what's the right amount of usage to sign up for, and turn those into quotes and proposals and so on. And so that's more customer facing than the metering and billing, which is more of a back office area. On the finance and planning side, then we start looking at, all right, how do we take what we're actually billing a customer or quoting a customer and translate that into how we recognize revenue and how we track different metrics, right? Because should we be measuring ARR classically, which we think of as like annual recurring revenue, but if in some cases we might have some subscription revenue and some usage-based revenue, what's the right way to measure the health of the business? How do we measure things like net dollar retention? Should that include usage, that not include usage, right? CAC payback, like there's so many questions. And so having tools to be able to have really good visibility into how you're performing across the metrics that really matter for the kind of business that you're building end up being super valuable. The last category I'll flag is just this automation one, which is one that I also think is quite interesting. Usage-based pricing often is paired with product-led growth, and I would sometimes say like usage-based pricing is the purest form of product-led growth out there because you're only getting paid as folks use more of the product. So it's extremely aligned with PLG. But on the automation side, you are looking at having a high velocity of experimentation with your customers, maybe being able to experiment on different usage paywalls between free and paid, or whether to meter based on metric A, B, or C. And so how do you get that implemented across all of the systems where it's needed, have a really consistent customer experience, being able to test different pricing and packaging iterations, and really freeing up growth teams and product teams able to do that work without being as reliant on engineering. That's where you start seeing the rise of automation-oriented pricing tools.
Super interesting. Last question before we kick it over to some questions. How should SaaS finance folks think about how traditional SaaS versus usage-based SaaS stack up, especially when it comes to the benchmarks or metrics that they should be keeping in mind?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, another slide here. So we've found on the growth side, usage-based companies they're still outperforming peers in terms of revenue growth. I'd say last year when we did the study, our first usage-based pricing report, usage-based companies were like significantly outperforming the broader SaaS index. Now there's still some outperformance, but it's like 17% growth versus 13% growth. It's come down on both sides. And so that's one where it's just everyone cares about revenue growth and ideally profitable growth, but we're not seeing massive differences. And I think part of that is maybe even due to the blurring of the lines between what really means you're a usage-based company versus not. Everyone's kind of doing a mix of the two right now. I think folks should be looking at net dollar retention specifically. And in a usage-based company, you expect to see more seamless expansion within an account. That's at least the hope, right? If you're not seeing it, then obviously there's some gaps that you have, whether that's in the sales process, in the product, customer success, you name it. But I would expect to see higher averages, higher benchmarks for net dollar retention in a usage-based business compared to a more traditional software company. And really, that's a very important North Star metric from an investor standpoint, because it shows the health of your business and how sticky the product is with customers. On the NDR side, I think that, like, to me, one of the things I often see with traditional SaaS companies is that usage is growing faster than spend, especially for kind of key product metrics. And so if you have not adopted usage-based pricing, one of the things to look at to even figure out what are the best metrics to be charging against would be to look at where you see that in-account growth, right? Are you seeing 50% year-over-year growth within your cohorts of metric A, but they're only spending 10% more? All right, then we might want to reorient how we're pricing. I used to be a pricing consultant, and one of my first usage-based project examples was with a telco provider, right? They were seeing minutes of talk were decreasing, but data usage was increasing, right? And so obviously they wanted to reorient their pricing towards the metric that was really scaling within a customer. Today, I mean, rule of 40 and just showing that you have efficient growth is very correlated with valuations. But then otherwise, just things that are not on the slide that I'd call out for usage-based companies. Just total customer count ends up being important. So often with a usage model, you're opening up access at a lower entry point. And so you want to be proving out that you can meaningfully influence the number of new customer adds that you have compared to a more traditional model. And not every one of those new customers that you add is going to be successful and scale. But it's almost like, you're thinking like a VC, right? You're going to make a lot of bets. Some of those bets are not going to pay off, but others are going to start maybe at spending $1,000 a year and all of a sudden end up spending $1 million a year because they're so successful with your product. But you really want to look at number of customer adds within your ICP as an important metric. That's a signal, a leading indicator, a signal of the future health of the business.
I had one sort of quick follow-up question here. To the extent that you were mentioning that sort of usage-based pricing companies are canary in the coal mine when things are either going down or on the way back up, given all the talk of recession, one might have actually expected worse results from usage-based pricing companies. And I'm curious why you think that's not the case.
Well, usage-based companies, they don't have any shelfware generally, or they have much less shelfware compared to more traditional subscription businesses. So folks are only paying on the basis of how much they use the product. And that's a really powerful argument for customers, right? And they are generally very close to customers. They're very, they're not hiding any maybe inefficiencies or lack of value just because they've signed up a 3-year committed deal with a large enterprise 2 years ago. And so I think like usage-based companies are just resilient because they're delivering real value to customers, and there's a signal that value is being realized. I think otherwise, SaaS is so integrated with our workflows just as businesses. And so for many usage-based companies, like if you think about, let's take like automation examples with companies that provide API access. You've done the work to set up integrations with all the different tools, sending data from place A to place B to place C, and you're being charged based on API calls. Well, just because the economy is difficult doesn't mean that you have less data, you have fewer API calls. And so you're not necessarily going to be spending less on these kinds of tools. And in fact, many of these metrics continue to grow in an account as you rely more on technology rather than people in order to scale the business. And so I think that for many usage-based companies, they're both delivering real value, they don't have shelfware, and the way that they're pricing allows them to really scale independent of some other factors.
Super great points. Phil, I think there's a few questions, so I'll let you take that away.
Yeah, thanks, Siddharth, and thanks, Kyle. So I just opened up the Q&A for everyone, but we already do have some questions. So as folks find Q&A on their screen and type in whatever questions are top of mind. We had a few come in. I'll start with the one from Pete, and I'm going to paraphrase a bit, but basically they're having a challenging time forecasting because, actually, I'm just going to read it instead of try to summarize. So one challenge of forecasting is valuing pipeline and conversion. It says this is highly varied and more subjective than if your sales team has a clear ACV. So any advice on how to handle that, either Kyle or Siddharth?
Yeah, I mean, that is a great question. I think it's honestly a challenge for everyone right now, regardless of usage-based, non-usage-based. And generally for a lot of companies, pipeline in terms of like MQLs has been resilient or maybe has even increased, but it's not necessarily translating into net new closed won ARR, and deals are getting delayed, they're getting more scrutiny. There's a lot of more closed, no decisions. And so I just think that this is true regardless. I don't have a ton of really helpful advice because a lot of the changes are more around your customers. And so I think that the key things I would have would be just enforce really good Salesforce hygiene or CRM hygiene to make sure that you don't have happy years and are moving deals through the pipeline based on what you want to hear, but that you're actually doing the real discovery needed to understand where you are within an account. Like if you have never talked to the VP of finance and you're trying to sell a $50,000 or $100,000 deal, you probably shouldn't put that deal in commit, right? Like that's just not going to be great pipeline management practices. So really audit how that Salesforce is treating pipeline and expected conversion. I think that you should expect that you maybe are going to see, especially with the usage models, some of the initial lands come in at a smaller dollar size. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Like I would rather land someone at a compelling price point that maybe gets the scrutiny internally and then have confidence in the product and the value you're going to deliver and the ability to kind of grow with your customer. And so you might want to plan for that as the new reality, but just get kind of a closer look on where deals have come in recently and whether sales is incentivized to even land these deals at a lower price point. Because I'd rather close the deal, get that customer in the door, consuming the product, knowing that you can expand them later, rather than just having the deal drag on or never close in the first place.
Makes a ton of sense. Thanks, Kyle. I'm going to hop to the question from Guy. Farhan, don't hold it against me. Your question was very similar to Pete. So if you have a spin-off that we didn't touch on, Farhan, let me know in chat. Guy was wondering if you don't count this usage-based revenue as ARR, then like why do you count it as a part of expansion or as a part of net dollar retention, or like what are the rules for that? How are companies handling that or thinking about that?
Yeah, there's kind of a newer version of ARR that I would say is like ARR in quotes. It's like annual run rate revenue or annual reoccurring revenue is sort of the like catch-all that people are using. So they're still calling it by the ARR acronym, even though it's a different definition. And to me, if the revenue acts like it's recurring, you should be treating it and valuing it like it's recurring revenue. And so that's where the usage-based component, if it is one-time usage, right, it's not reoccurring, then that's a very different situation. But if it's something that tends to grow or stay consistent within an account on average or across 1,000 customers, you can treat it like it's ARR, and then therefore you should value it accordingly. You should comp sales based on it and not just on the upfront commitment. You should incorporate it in your expansion, revenue, and NDR calculations. And so I would just also be mindful of, hey, here's our total run rate revenue, and then here's the breakdown, right, of committed, non-committed. And so being able to really unpack that so that you're not hiding anything, but also just make sure you're not undercounting, the success of your business on an arbitrary basis. I think it did seem like Farhan had a question similar to Pete's, but framed slightly differently, and maybe we cover that one too. If that makes sense, Phil?
Totally, let's do it. This will be our last question.
It was, how is everyone allocating a value to a UBP deal in your CRM when it's closed? If there's no minimum commits, do we just actualize over time and get better, or assign estimated values as best guesstimate? This is a great question. I think that in many cases for these closed won deals, you have some usage history, like there's a pilot or proof of concept before you count the deal as closed won. Or you generally have, in a lot of cases, the disproportionate amount of the revenue comes from commitments. But in cases where it's not, it's truly very flexible, I would tend to assign a value based on an expected ARR from similar profiles of customers. as the kind of guesstimate that you for CRM purposes. So you can look at, hey, for companies that are, this is an SMB segment deal within these industries, first year spend historically has been this. That'll help you understand how many resources to put against a deal, and just what sort of healthy will look like. And you'll know that, hey, this isn't committed. It might not look like this, but it could be way better and it could be way worse. On average, we think it ends up looking like X. And this goes with things like payments revenue too, by the way. So if you sell a subscription business, but then have variable or non-committed payments revenue on top, you would want to look to that history to estimate a value for what the payments revenue is going to look like.
Awesome. Thank you, Kyle. And more broadly, just thank you so much for being here and sharing your insights. I love listening to you and listening to Siddharth geek out about all things usage-based pricing. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Phil. That's fun.
Thank you.
Please go enjoy the Boston
on all
weather.
of these topics.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Enjoy that wonderful Boston weather today. For those of you that missed, I think it's 70 and sunny, and Kyle still joined us. That is true.
Yes, and I'm looking at a roof deck right here. So I don't know if people can see it.
Yes.
That's where I'm off to next.
Go out there. All right. We'll see you later, Kyle. Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye. All right. And let me welcome up our next speaker here. Chitra, I'm going to add you to the stage. Hopefully you're in a spot where we're good to add. Can you hear us okay, Chitra?
I can. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for joining us.
Sure.
So this next session for everyone, I'll share my screen in a second, but we were so excited to have Chitra join us because we wanted to talk about what it's actually like to lead a finance team at a usage-based pricing business. And I don't think there's anyone better to talk to than you, Chitra, who's been doing it for quite a few years now at a company who is really like one of the pioneers when it comes to usage-based pricing. So thank you so much for being here. Siddharth, I'm going to hand it off to you. I'm going to disappear from the stage and feel free to kick things off.
Thank you, Phil.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So excited you're doing this with us, Chitra. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. As Phil mentioned, Circle CI is sort of one of the pioneers in usage-based pricing, and you have more experience with it than most. But to kick it off, hoping you could share with our audience what Circle CI is and what the company does and how the pricing sort of plays into that, especially around the delivering value and aligning with delivering value.
Yes, happy to. So Circle CI is a software tool within the DevOps space. So our end customers or end users really are software development teams looking to bring in automation to help them move faster in what they do, right? So they write some code, but before that code can make its way into the actual production code, a lot of steps have to happen in between to automate the testing, making sure all of the code is validated before it's actually live in production. So Circle CI basically helps to automate all of that stuff in between. We're sort of the assembly line of code production. And so because of that, because of the inherent nature of code varying from company to company, it made a lot of sense for us to adopt a usage-based model because, you may be at a company and you may be a developer who's just changing a font from red to blue. That takes a very different level of power, of compute power to test and deploy than, say, coding some sort of machine learning, kind of algorithm, which is probably a lot more compute intensive, probably requires a lot more testing across various sort of applications in order to ensure that it's validated and ready for production. So because of the variability in what we're doing for customers, it really made sense for us to basically adopt more of this usage-based model so we can align our actual value to the different types of jobs, the different sizes of jobs that end up getting processed. And so the way we sell is typically, and I will caveat this by saying we do have sort of a hybrid model. We have a product-led growth sort of model coupled with the tops-down enterprise selling motion. So when customers that have come onto our platform on a self-serve basis eventually reach a point where it makes sense for them to have a conversation with a sales rep, we have that kind of enabled so that we can do that. But at the same time, we don't want to have unnecessary friction in the kind of go-to-market motion to, add unnecessary hurdles for people to get up and running if they, want to on their own. So we have a very, I would say, a model that adjusts or adapts to what the customer's needs are, both from a product perspective as well as from a kind of selling or go-to-market motion perspective. So we sell credits to customers and allow them to deploy those credits onto our platform as they see fit, as their work requires. So think of it sort of like a Clipper card. For those of you in the Bay Area, or for those in other metropolitan cities, if you have want to use the train system, bus system, etc., typically what you do is you buy a card, load a bunch of value onto that card, and then as you use the train from point A to point B, it depletes a certain value to that. And then you have a balance, which can then be used towards other things that may be a different cost. And once you get down to a certain low watermark, if you will, on your card, you can refill. You can either auto refill, have this auto refill, or designate how much you want to do. So we sort of deploy a model kind of similar to some of these train systems and what have you.
Original usage-based companies.
Yes.
Can you give us some sense of scale?
Yeah, so we have been around for a while, and we served thousands of customers at this point, and are pretty large in terms of revenue, kind of north of that 75 million mark in terms of kind of overall revenue of the business, and growing pretty quickly. So I would say that we're running a pretty large scale platform, since we run a lot of bills for thousands of companies, which is quite intensive in terms of compute and orchestration of all sorts of different resources.
So with that context, starting with sort of a big picture question, since a lot of folks are relatively new to the usage-based pricing world, do you have any just general advice for finance leaders who are adding usage-based pricing?
Yeah, no, I think I truly love the usage-based pricing model. Of course, it's very challenging in a lot of regards, but I think the first thing I would say about a usage-based model is it really is sort of like a full contact sport. It's not something that you can just kind of lightly take on. It really does have implications that span the entire organization. So having a usage-based model, for example, requires your product to have a lot of inbuilt mechanisms for tracking, metering, provisioning, et cetera, that really has to be kind of thought about upfront, not as an afterthought to the process. Because, as Kyle mentioned earlier, and by the way, everything he said was like, I was really like nodding over here, because it was very much correct, right? You need to have the right mechanisms to actually bill, right? You need to be able to be transparent around usage so that customers actually can validate their bill and say, yeah, I did use that much, or be able to know that, oh gosh, I only have so much left in my balance because I've used this much to date. There's a lot of data and information that needs to be at the ready when you have a model like this. So thinking about all of those kind of data elements early on will definitely make the job a lot easier. I mean, I'm saying, not even talking about forecasting and the whole set of challenges that come with forecasting, but even just for running the model, for servicing the customers, for basic revenue recognition and accounting, you need to be able to have pretty good data and timely data, auditable data, to be able to run this model.
Actually, can we talk about forecasting? How do you think about it?
Oh. How do I think about it? Yeah, I think about it often. I think ultimately with the usage-based model, since you don't have the luxury of kind of subscription that a subscription model does, right? Where at the start of the contract, kind of what the revenue amount is going to be. You do have to really start building that historical data set and cut yourself some slack early on, right? Early on, it's not going to be perfect, but with this model, forecasting should improve over time, right? You get a base of information, you leverage what you have for new customers. As I know Kyle had mentioned this earlier, what do you do if you bring on a new customer? You don't really have enough information to estimate what their potential revenue is. Well, then let's see, what other customers might you have that are similar? What were their kind of ramp patterns like? And actually, I'm thinking back to when we first introduced this model 5-6 years ago, when we were moving from sort of a classic subscription to a usage model. One of the things we tracked early on was how the customers' usage actually evolved over several months. What we found was there was actually like an interesting inflection point after a certain month, and we saw that consistently across customers. And what happened was, customers were a little bit scared up front. They weren't sure how to necessarily calibrate their usage, how to use the product efficiently. But, call it, I'm just making this up, like month 4, everyone realized, oh, we know how this works. Let's now amp up, and you could see like the inflection of their usage. And you saw that over and over and over again, which whenever you see something repeatedly, it's helpful, right? It's helpful for forecasting. And so that way, we started to just build that data set of historical data to understand how we could maybe apply that to newer customers. And the other thing about forecasting is typically in a usage-based model, the vast majority of your revenue growth, incremental revenue, is going to come from expansion of new account or of existing accounts rather than from new accounts. Sure, you can have some large new accounts coming in and having a meaningful contribution to your base, but really the vast majority of your revenue is going to come from, most likely, from the existing customers, which is helpful when you have cohort data, when you have some historical understanding of how these patterns are. Net dollar retention can help you with forecasting.
One thing I'm curious about is some of the evolution of your customers' usage that was true 5 years ago. Is that stay steady over time? Like, do you feel like that still applies in 2023, what was true in 2018, or is it different now?
I think there are the underlying, I would say, usage is similar, right? Like, but I think the thing that changes is, our product offerings evolve. Customers, as they mature with the product, tend to get more sophisticated with how they use our product. They may automate more work. Therefore, the amount of usage for a given user might actually change, right? There are different let me back up for a second and talk a little bit about usage itself, right? And for forecasting, one thing that's really important or useful for forecasting is to actually double click on usage itself. What are the drivers of usage within your business, right? In the case of the train, if I'm a user who always uses the BART, that's interesting. That's informative. I go 5 days a week. Understanding that pattern is helpful. Whereas there may be another user who actually does the bus, the train, and then walks, right? Like, understanding those different configurations can help with forecasting. And for us, it's like, okay, we've got different components of how people use our credits. They can use it towards users on the platform. They can use it towards support. They can use it towards actual compute resources, which are, more of the underlying power to run jobs. Now, there are also relationships among these different items, right? For users, if you've got a certain number of users, but their ratio of user to usage remains consistent from month over month, then you can use that information again for forecasting. If your sales team is to sign up another 100 developers or users within the organization, you know that any given user tends to deploy X amount of usage. Let's apply that same ratio in order to forecast or project for this company what their usage could be based on this additional cell into them. And so like you want to be able to dissect, or at least double click a little bit into those leading indicators for usage within an organization. Is it, are there no new teams? New teams are going to be just net beneficial to your usage, or is it simply more usage per given user, right? Those types of ratios are important.
All this like really underscores your first point about the data problem when it comes to usage billing.
Yes.
It's like so much more significant than a seat-based billing model.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a lot. I mean, it's a lot to manage, to sort of like command. And so it does become important for all departments within the company to have some savviness around data, right? It's important in terms of the product itself. The product teams need to have a strong data kind of skill set and capability. Your finance teams, also need to be comfortable with large amounts of data and using tools that actually will help to kind of control that data. You'll see a lot of data science teams, data analysis teams within usage-based companies. And part of that is you do need to be able to apply some sophistication around it.
Actually, then speaking of teams, does the fact that you have a usage-based model mean that your finance team is structured any differently than what you've seen in past roles?
I wouldn't say it's structured differently, but I think some of the skill sets may be a little bit different. Like we still, within our organization, we have kind of your corporate, folks who focused on kind of the consolidated view of the business. You've got folks focused on sort of go-to-market support, R&D support. So you have sort of some of those classic finance business partnership structure within our team, but everybody does have to be mindful of the usage piece, be a little bit more comfortable with that model and leveraging large amounts of data. So I would say the actual personas or the individuals within those kind of traditional areas within finance are just probably a bit more, I would say, savvy and comfortable with modeling and also leveraging data teams for inputs.
That makes so much sense. From the very first conversation we had, one thing that struck me is that you use cohorts more than almost any other finance leader I know. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always been a very valuable tool for us. And, you hear there's always like a trendy metric of the day. A lot of people talk about dollar-based net revenue retention. That's a big one today. That's a little bit more, I would say, of a flat metric in that it's not necessarily cohorted. It's just looking at your customer base from the start of the period to the end of the period and taking kind of a flat view. It's useful because it does give you that way of understanding growth within a fixed period. But the reason why I also like to look at cohorted views of expansion is because it gives you that forecasting assist, right? A DBNRR over a 1-year period across your entire base is not necessarily going to give you that insight into how different customer segments are performing. Whereas if you are to actually kind of like double click, look at cohorts, you can get a better sense of, hey, how are the newer cohorts performing? They may actually be growing much faster than some of your older cohorts, or vice versa. And being able to kind of like break that down gives you a better insight into how sort of your next year growth expectations are going to pan out, right? If you're seeing different levels of growth, it helps to just to be smarter about how you're forecasting versus taking a flat number across your entire base.
On the net revenue retention sort of front, both either as a one-dimensional or as a two-dimensional metric, I'm curious how you think about the sort of usage-based component and what that means for like how it changes in the first year and the second year and so on. Um, it feels like net revenue retention is like very complex in a usage-based world, and there's so many ways to define it. So I'm very curious to hear your thoughts.
Um, it it is complex, but at the same time, it's sort of a nice. I actually find that it helps simplify a little bit. It's
Yeah.
a simple measure to see how your existing base is growing, and that's a significant portion of your overall growth rate gives you a quick view into that. And being able to track it from quarter to quarter also gives you some underlying indication of health of the business. So if newer cohorts are growing faster, that's a good sign. That gives you some sense of like how your product is performing. And as Kyle mentioned before, usage-based businesses cannot rely on shelfware, right? Like you only get revenue when you're providing value to customers. And if you're seeing that expansion decline over time, it's a sign that something is off, right? Are we off because we're not bringing on additional users to drive usage, or are we reaching a point for certain customers where they're maybe stagnating or they're not seeing more value from the product? It's a really important measure to be able to double click into to understand kind of the underlying health of the business. And so I think it's probably more important for our business than for many others to be able to like look into expansion rates and like dissect why or why not it, if it's growing or not. And there are different levers within usage that, there are different levers that drive usage growth. And this is sort of that top line metric that gives you some sense of health.
What do you do with that? Like if either a certain cohort or a certain set of customers or if that isn't going the way you want it to go in terms of expansions, how is the company set up to operationally to change behavior around that?
Yeah, I mean, the answer really would depend on the company itself and how it's structured. You can segment your revenue in different ways. It could be by business unit, it could be by go-to-market motion, right? So for us, we've got a sizable portion of our revenue that comes from our, call it self-serve, or really product-led side, but then we also have a significant portion that comes from our managed accounts. And so, for example, you can look into your revenue retention or your net revenue expansion rates by segment to see whether there's a segment issue or whether there's a problem, within a particular size of customers. Is it an SMB issue or is it something else? And by being able to at least hone in on where an issue is, you can then double click to see, is it a feature issue? Are we having, some sort of, maybe it's a credit card issue. You never know. It could be something really silly, but being actually able to segment out your expansion rates by some sort of meaningful segment for your business, whatever that might be, can help to kind of understand, can help you understand when a trend changes, where to at least start the conversation.
On that note, when it comes to like product launches or product changes, how do you feed that back into sort of having a better feedback loop for your engineering product teams?
The nice thing, and one of the reasons why I love this model is because it sort of aligns everything together. I don't know how to put this very articulately, but the way you work with customers is very aligned, right? They only see value, or you only see revenue when they see value. The way you build your products are also in alignment with this model. If the product is not useful, you're not going to see that credit usage take place. And so the way I think about product is, are we launching new things that are actually going to be used by the business, right? And you can see that very immediate, you can see that right away. It doesn't require another sell into through procurement or back, the sales team to actually go back to a customer in order for you to actually see immediate kind of usage or adoption of products, right? You can immediately feed that into the platform, and it can just be one additional way that a customer can deploy their credits for your business. So you get, I'd say with this model, like immediate feedback on how new products are actually getting adopted. And again, if the adoption is slow relative to what you expected, you could see whether it's a problem of maybe customers not knowing, awareness issue, or is it a actual adoption? Is it challenging to adopt for some reason? Again, you can like very quickly get a pulse on how new products are being leveraged by the customer.
And given the sort of credits model, I would assume that you have a lot more pricing levers than a typical company does, right? And each product launch and iterations over time. Does your team spend a lot of time thinking about like the right pricing for each thing, or how do you all handle that?
Pricing is really important in this model. We do have a dedicated pricing team within the company. I think it's important to do that. A lot of our products, a portion of our products do have underlying costs for us to service, right? We're running compute, we're running jobs on infrastructure, right? So there is some underlying just costs associated with that, which obviously sets the base for pricing. But then, we do have to look at what market pricing is for different types of jobs and factor all of that in to our pricing. But, we have lots of different SKUs that we've got to continually look at pricing and evaluate it on. But again, this model makes it easier to manage your pricing in some regard, right? Because you have this singular notion of a credit for your company that's somewhat easy to understand. And then, pricing behind that can evolve as you introduce new things in terms of the actual depletion rate. That's almost like the backside of the credit number, the face of the credit value itself. On the backside, the actual depletion rates can be flexed and managed over time.
Yep, totally. And then in terms of like pipeline and how much credit a salesperson gets in a new deal and some of the questions that folks had earlier, I'm curious how you manage that at Circle C, since you have the top-down model as well as the bottoms-up.
Yeah, this is a really good question, and there's so much I would say within this topic of sales compensation, of sales incentives, of how you want to actually have salespeople interact with the customer with a usage-based model. It is different than some of the other types of models that you have out there. And I'll say to be honest, we've really evolved this over time. We've iterated over time. We didn't have the perfect solution on day one, and I still don't think we have the perfect solution, but it's something we've tried to adjust over time. And what you heard Kyle mention earlier, which I fully agree with, is sometimes you typically don't want the sales team to oversell on an initial contract. It doesn't really make sense in a usage-based model, right? It's almost more important to kind of get your foot in the door and allow the customer to dictate what the contract value should be, what the usage is for them, right? Because ultimately, if you oversell a customer, that's a terrible experience, one, for the customer. Two, you're not going to see the revenue anyway, because in a model like this, you only recognize revenue once a customer uses the credits that they've purchased, right? So it sort of is a lose-lose situation if you oversell and the customer is not able to actually see the value. So it's almost better to try to get in there at a modest kind of contract level and then allow the customer to use the product and see what the more appropriate kind of contract level is for them going forward, right? Because the last thing you want to do is end up in a situation where you and the customer are kind of discussing, hey, what do we do in the situation where we overbought? Can we get a credit back? It's just not great for anybody. So in terms of how that gets back to how you incentivize your sales team and others, I would say if you are focused on only giving sales team credit for the booking amount, then they may feel like, hey, you're asking us to come in smaller on the booking. What about all of this upside that's going to come out from a revenue expansion perspective? How am I going to see some of that value, because that is what I sold? I think it's important to be able to give that back to your sales team, right? There are different ways of doing this, right? You can estimate what the revenue will be over the course of the period, or you can simply wait until the end of the period, and based on the actual revenue, incentive, provide your compensation to the sales team members. You can do it on a true up basis. There's some initial value provided on the actual commitment, but then if there's upside to that, you can kind of true that up. There's like different ways of sort of managing that, so that you're doing the right thing for the customer, and then also you're doing right by your sales team. It really depends on how you're set up from a data perspective, from a tooling perspective on the sales side, and what makes sense for the business.
That makes so much sense. Last question. How do you have any advice, or how do you think about sort of a credit-based system versus entirely a payment in arrears-based usage system? Like, what is the advantage of one model versus another?
Do you mind clarifying what you mean on the credit side?
Yeah, so like buying credits and then using those up versus using the product and then paying at the end of the period
Right.
based on like tallying it up at the end and just getting a bill.
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes down to kind of cash flow. That's a cash flow question, really, right? I think that we actually do multiple things within our company, right? So most of our managed customers sort of purchase credits upfront and then deploy that over the course of the year. And if they hit a point where they need additional credits, they purchase additional credits and then move forward. For our kind of self-serve customers, they pay monthly, right? They have smaller tranches of credits that they purchase with a credit card each month, and then they deploy that. In some cases, you can have payments in arrears, but again, if you have underlying expense as a business to fuel that, then it's just something you've got to manage from a cash flow standpoint, and getting comfort around collectibility of those payments. I think that comes down to kind of a pure finance question, a pure collections question. But it's certainly, I mean, I think it's great for a customer if you can make that happen. But it is something that you'd have to manage, I would say, from an actual dollar perspective.
Yep, makes total sense. Phil, I'll leave it to you with the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chitra, and thanks, Siddharth. You're not off the hook yet, though. The hard part is the Q&A. So I just opened it up for folks, but we already had one question that came in earlier from E, and he was curious to hear about the kind of the tooling and tech stack to support usage-based at scale from a finance standpoint. Can you share a little bit of whatever you're comfortable sharing there, Chitra?
Sure. There are a lot of tools that we use, and a lot of it is actually, a fair amount is home built stuff. I would say more on the product team side. So for our actual product, it's critical that we've had to build out, like the provisioning, metering, those types of things. It's sort of core to the actual product functionality itself. I just want to highlight that because that is important for a finance team as well, right? Because if a lot of that information is sitting within the product itself, in order to report revenue, in order to forecast other things, you need to have the right mechanism to be able to actually pull that information, right? You can do that in different ways. You can do it as simply as pulling a spreadsheet out of, downloading raw data from your product, or you could do that in other ways, like pulling it into a NetSuite or a Subscript or what have you. You can pull it into a different solution in order to then process that information a bit better. So that's kind of one piece of it. I would definitely say from a reporting perspective, we do a lot in terms of housing the data in various data warehouses, and there are a variety of tools that our data team actually uses to mine that information and produce reports that we can then take from a finance perspective and run our own forecasting off of. So, we do regression analyses, we do just basic stuff in Excel. We do a lot of different things in order to triangulate into a forecast, because it's something where we can't do it in one. There's no one singular way to forecast this business. You have to really approach it from several different angles to get, I would say, the best indication. So we do a lot there. Quote to cash is a big thing, right? Like being able to equip the sales team. We use Salesforce and have some modules within that to help actually track the initial commitments, but then we end up having to track that all the way through our financial systems to ultimately get to the actual revenue that was generated. So there's this almost difference between the initial commitment and the actual revenue in a usage-based model, which is an important distinction because they're both important. One is important in terms of how a sales organization kind of conducts their business, but the other is important in terms of how you actually report from a business perspective. And then the relationship between those two are also very important from a forecasting perspective. So being able to actually relate those two and have a seamless connection between your actual commitment values or contract values and actual revenue becomes, I would say, very important as well. So making sure you have that full view from initial sale all the way to actual final usage, I think is one of the most important things for a finance team to have access to.
Thank you, Chitra, and thanks, E, for the question. Michelle asks about, we've obviously talked a lot about the importance of data in the finance work that you have to do at a usage-based pricing business. Can you talk a little bit more about what the resourcing looks like for your finance team? Is there a dedicated data team mapped to finance? Do they report to you? Is it a separate group? Anything there that you can share would be helpful.
Yeah, no, we have a central data team that does not report into me, but into kind of more of a BizOps function that, at one point, I think I had that reporting into me. So it's you can have that reporting into CFO or to another central kind of operational group. Doesn't really matter as long as you have that group and have access to those resources. That's what becomes very critical. I would say, having at least one person within a data organization generally devoted to finance is probably the minimum. I would say sometimes it does require a little bit more than that at certain times of the month or when you are initially setting up your overall models. But after that, once you can get things automated, reporting automated, then the lift kind of goes down quite a bit. So it's really that initial setup that is really important. But then having somebody available for, additional things along the way is helpful. But you probably need at least one kind of dedicated data resource, like an analytics person. But then your financial analysts themselves, if it's helpful if they're data savvy, but at the minimum, they should be able to kind of work with someone on the data side. But it's helpful if they also have a bit of that data kind of background.
Great.
It gets gnarly.
Yes, it sounds that way.
Yeah.
And then we'll make this one our kind of last question, and then after this, we'll take a short break and then jump into roundtables. Pete is asking about your experience about how investors see usage-based pricing, both during a raise and then with the board. Do you have to educate them on these detailed views that you're talking about, or adapt them to these metrics, or anything along those lines?
Oh, this is such a good question. This has really evolved since I've been at the company over the last 6 years. I remember the initial raise that I was part of when I first joined the company was very hard. it was very hard to try to explain kind of this reoccurring revenue that's associated with a usage-based model in an ARR world. And so I remember we really tried to kind of like squeeze our data into this like subscription view, and it was really hard to try to kind of get that understanding to investors. I would say investors' understanding has really evolved over the last several years. They're way more sophisticated now. They have a much deeper understanding of this type of model today than they did initially. And so I think the conversation is just much easier today than it was before. And I think the thing I would just recommend is just lean into this model. It's a lovely model. If you are doing it, like just lean into it. Don't try to necessarily like squeeze this data set or your numbers into some other model just because it's easier for someone to understand. What will end up happening is you'll end up kind of reverting back to having to explain it the natural way anyway, because it just doesn't make sense to try to put a, I guess, square peg in a round hole, right? So investor understanding has improved a lot. It's all about the key metrics that they look at are, net dollar or dollar-based net revenue retention. That's super important. Being able to understand the growth of your customers from, one tier of revenue to a higher tier of revenue. Are you able to actually get that expansion, get the promise of expansion and prove that you're able to do that? I think that becomes important in kind of conveying your ability to actually effectively run this type of model. Are you showing value, proving value, growing that value over time with customers?
Thank you so much, Chitra. That is so helpful. And sipping out a little bit, thank you just so much for joining us today. I was so excited to have you here, and somehow you managed to exceed my expectations. So I don't know how you do it, but really, really grateful.
You're too kind. Thank you for having me. This is super fun. I could definitely talk about this topic all day long. So I appreciate you giving me a chance to discuss it.